So I want to talk a little bit about level design at different studios. Different studios sort of have different ways of doing things with level design, and the reason why is because it's sort of a thing that encompasses a lot of different types of fields. There's a lot to it that is about architecture, about the way that shapes come together, how people see shapes. Um, a lot of it is, the history of architecture, and when we're creating spaces that are based on uh, real historical spaces, having a sense of and a study in architectural shapes and the types of things that go into building structures and making structures believable, a lot of that falls into the field of architecture. And then there's also a lot of just logic and coding. I even started, like I said before, as a scripter when I first started the Terminal Reality, and kind of light programming and designing kind of a lot of times go together because there's a lot of sort of logic flow that really needs to be understood about, like how players enter spaces, how they're contained, things like that. So there really is quite a lot of um, you know thinking about design and game logic that goes into putting a level together. There's also a lot to the job that has to do with planning and production. Being able to communicate ideas well to all the different departments, to be able to schedule and to schedule production, schedule development, schedule when props are coming in, do planning as far as paper maps and putting together flow charts and things like that. And so being able to communicate all that is, I don't know, it doesn't a lot of times fit within the purview of just one person. And that's why a lot of times studios tend to sort of break this job up into a lot of different positions, or a lot of different positions at least touch on level design at one point or another during production. So I wanted to look a little bit about overall in the studio structure, who touches and who owns the levels. And I think the first step, we'll just kind of start from the top down and look at, there's a creative director, or a lot of these titles may not be perfect for whatever the position is, but so it's a creative director or a director or writer that is determining sort of the context of the world, that tells us, this is the time frame of the world, this is these are the characters in it, and down to this particular level, this is the situation that we're looking at. Below that creative director are often a number of different positions that might have some sort of influence on level design. That could be, design directors, a world director that sort of keeps an eye on the entire map of the world, art director that might define sort of a style guide, or color keys that influence maybe the look of the world. There's a lot of concept art that goes into even thinking about, like, when do we're going to start making levels, so let's sort of blue sky it and figure out like what would be really cool. Drawing up world maps, if we're looking at more of like an open world game, we may need to have someone coordinating that the overall shape of the world. Lead designer that may be involved with putting together metrics so that everyone across the departments and all these different jobs understands how our game interrelates with shapes in the world. And then we start looking at people actually touching directly on the levels. So systems designers here on the left side of the spectrum here in the design area, where systems designers will create new systems and new mechanics and make prototype levels where they can sort of demonstrate and prove out gameplay that can be sort of populated across the rest of the world. You've got mission designers who maybe they just look at sort of the narrative flow of a level, and they may not be as involved with the level creation itself, with the blockout, or maybe they just do small amounts of blockout just to do like massing models and show the artists or the level designers what kind of shapes they need. But a lot of times mission designers tend to be a little bit more on the technical and just the design sort of side. Position as level designer, which I've held at one point or another, and this tends to be a designer who gets hands-on with the sort of massing model, with blockout, with putting together prototypes and with brushes and things like that in order to actually map out the shape of the world. And at some point they may eventually hand that off to artists, but at least the shape of the world or the shape of the level is sort of in their hands. Depending on studio, this sort of position kind of flops back and forth between on sort of design-oriented or art-oriented. At some studios, like there's level artists who are almost they have design sense. They have control over the world, but they tend to be a little bit more art-oriented. Farther onto the art side of the spectrum, environment artists. So like at Naughty Dog, and I'll go through this in just a second, but as a level designer, I might make blockout, but then after I prove it out, then I'll work directly with an environment artist who then takes it and gives context to it, gives the actual shape, or not shape, but the details to it, and makes it work within a larger whole of what the world is. And finally, texture artists who actually put texture and color and things like that into sort of the polish of the game, but don't have as much to do necessarily with the shape design. So all of these essentially in this level is the people that I'm sort of speaking to specifically in this class of like being hands-on with the level. How do you shape it? How do you use it in order to communicate directly with the player? So we look at a lot of different ways that these people essentially can work on and influence the shape of their levels. So anyway, a lot of these different positions, like for instance at Naughty Dog, like we don't even have all of these positions. But as you look at sort of different studios, how they do things, sort of the balance of, like, for instance, who actually owns the levels and the environments kind of balances from design to art, and it really kind of depends on the studio, on the history of the studio, on the types of games they tend to make. So like at Naughty Dog, for instance, we've got sort of an overall direction from our creative director, but and sort of concept art that sort of feeds into how we're going to think about the levels, but then layout designers themselves are doing this all in blockout. So the actual the mass model shapes that you're going to see here, the actual things that you interact with as the player, are things created by the layout designer. And then that's then eventually handed off to environment artists who try to stay within that constraint of the overall shape. And there may be some back and forth and some cooperation there. And in fact, our better levels, I think, have more cooperation than those that have less cooperation, because we really have to have sort of a balance between the art and the design. But I think that at least at Naughty Dog, we tend to sort of aim a little bit more on the power of design as far as like who controls the shape of the environment. And I think that's very much true at Epic Games, as far as I can tell, and from people I've talked to, that the Gears of War games like Bulletstorm, tend to be, they have a very good balance with designing art, but it tends to push a little bit more and in the design sense of things. From what I understand, when you look at a game like Bioshock Infinite, at Irrational Games, it tends to slide a little bit more the other way, where artists tend to have a little bit more of the power in the situation of who owns the art, and I think that's true for Dishonored 2 as well, or Dishonored and Arcane Studios, even though you can see amazing part of, I'm sorry, you can see how well these games are from a design perspective. So this is not just a complete, I'm not saying that sort of artists have complete control over this, or maybe they're artists with a lot of design background, I don't know. But just basically kind of breaking down a little bit of how sort of the more linear sort of shaped games approach level design. But when you start to look at open world games, things tend to get a little bit different. So looking at Assassin's Creed, for instance. So the trouble is that when you're trying to make a world that is as big as an Assassin's Creed, the sort of type of intricate design spaces that sort of we make at Naughty Dog or at some of the other more linear game sort of studios that I've mentioned, it doesn't quite scale out to that size. It takes a lot of time to make a sort of a well-designed space that works directly with your mechanics. And when you look at a world like this, where it's just how would you possibly have the time to sort of design every single block of every one of their cities? It's sort of they end up with kind of more of what's called a world first design. So world first in that essentially the world comes first. They research the maps that they're going to create for the overall shape of the landscape and these cities. The artists create the world, and then essentially mission designers then create missions within those. So the world exists almost first, and then we sort of pour gameplay into that. In that sense, I think the design department tends to focus a lot more on sort of systemic gameplay, things that can be repeated over and over and sort of layered on top of one another. And that there are some, especially the more narrative mission, the major narrative mission designers will tend to have a little bit more say on the major landmarks, but the overall shape of the world tends to be very sort of art oriented, and the major landmarks are kind of spaced apart because they tend to be high in like texture memory and things like that, so you tend to have to like space them out to a certain extent. And this is also true sort of in a game like Infamous Second Son, where Seattle is sort of built out as a living creature on its own. Mission designers sort of work within those constraints, or at least as much as I understand. So there is a bit of a balance, I think, more to be seen in a game like Watch Dogs 2, where designers often would be assigned specific locations, like for any particular mission. Like if you're going to have a mission that is in one particular building with like a startup company or something like that, you may have a designer that sort of they're owning that building, they're blocking out that building, and once that sort of they iterate and process with that, they work with an artist in order to art the level up and to also fit it into the overall world, which the world itself is kind of art directed. And this is probably true, I think, for like Far Cry games as well. Let's see, and from what I understand, also very true for kind of the Elder Scrolls games and Fallout games. So this is Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, where what I believe to be the case is that artists tend to essentially own the landscape, and designers own the what they call dungeon, which is kind of a catch-all for the towns, the castles, the caves, etc., and things like that. Bethesda themselves tends to be a big proponent of what are called modular kits. So you can see from this is from Joel Burgess, the lead level designer for lead game designer, I believe, for Skyrim, and this is an example from his GDC talk that he did a few years ago on how they start with sort of a modular kit for building out a dungeon. They start out with something sort of simple like this in order to give them kind of a basic rule set for what they're going to be building out, and they work with the artists in order to come up with something that sort of like works for both of them. And this then gets built out into sort of an overall kit like this, which can then be used to create level after level. So when you are working on a game that sort of has the sort of the size, the amount of content that a game like Skyrim is, where they had more than 40 towns, farms, and cities, 300 plus dungeons, and they had a much smaller team than, in fact, Naughty Dog has. Having this sort of modular kit approach is something that works really well to scale out to that. And depending on how you put those kits together, they can either be very squarish, but as you can see in this case right here, various modular brushes can be essentially used in order to build the overall shape, and then various, I guess, other things can be slotted in order to create a nice round sign.